I don't think I'll ever forget that hike. It was supposed to be a simple overnight trip. Just me, the woods, and a quiet stretch of backcountry trail. I'd done solo hikes before, nothing too extreme, just long enough to get away from everything for a while. This one should have been no different. The plan was to start early, hike about 15 miles into the forest, set up camp near a small creek, and hike back the next morning. I checked the weather, clear skies, mild temperatures, the kind of conditions that made the woods feel welcoming. I packed light: a tent, a small stove, enough food for 2 days, a water filter, and the usual survival essentials. Nothing about this trip seemed unusual when I set out. The trail started out easy, wide, well-trodden, the kind of path that sees a fair number of weekend hikers. It wound through dense forest, mostly pine and oak, with the occasional break where the land opened up into fields of thick underbrush. I made good time, covering about 8 miles before noon. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. The last person I passed was about 5 miles in, an older man with a heavy pack, moving slow but steady in the opposite direction. We nodded to each other, and that was it. After that, I was alone. It's strange how the forest feels different when you're truly alone. There's a quiet that sets in, a kind of silence you don't get in the city or even in campgrounds. The sounds you do hear, the rustling of leaves, the occasional snap of a branch, birds calling in the distance, stand out more. They feel sharper. Every noise makes you aware of how isolated you really are. By mid-afternoon, I reached the section of the trail that was less maintained. The dirt path narrowed, roots and rocks jutting out, the kind of terrain that forces you to slow down and watch every step. I liked it, though. It felt more like real hiking. Away from the easy, well-marked trails and into something quieter, more natural. That's why I did these trips in the first place. Around mile 12, I started noticing something odd. The trees here were scarred, deep gashes in the bark, the kind that didn't look like natural damage. At first, I thought maybe a bear had been clawing at them, but the marks were too clean, too precise. Not the random swipes of an animal. They looked deliberate. I stopped to examine one, running my fingers over the grooves. Fresh, maybe a few weeks old. I wasn't sure what to make of it, but I kept going. A mile later, I found something else. An old campsite, long abandoned, just off the trail, barely visible through the underbrush. The remains of a fire pit, blackened stones, and the rusted frame of what had once been a small tent. The fabric was gone, rotted away or taken by animals, but the poles were still there, half buried in the dirt. A backpack sat nearby, torn open, its contents scattered. Old clothes, a crushed water bottle, a boot with the sole peeling away. It had been there for a long time. Years, maybe. Something about it made me uneasy. People abandon campsites all the time, but this one didn't feel right. It felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Like whoever had been here left in a hurry and never came back. I didn't touch anything, just took a few steps back and moved on. The last few miles to the creek were slower. The trail was harder to follow. Overgrown in places, the markers faded or missing entirely. I had to check my map more often than I liked. It wasn't enough to make me turn back, but I was aware of how deep into the woods I was now. If something went wrong, there was no easy way out. I reached the creek just before sunset. It was a narrow stream, clear water moving over smooth stones, surrounded by a small clearing. A good spot for a campsite. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, gathered some wood for a small fire, and cooked a quick meal. As the sun dropped behind the trees, the temperature cooled, the forest settling into that familiar nighttime stillness. I should have felt at ease. Instead, there was an uneasiness in my gut that I couldn't shake. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I'd seen one too many weird things on the way in, and my mind was playing tricks. But I kept glancing over my shoulder, listening for something that wasn't there. At some point, I realized I wasn't alone. It wasn't a noise that gave it away. It was the feeling, that deep, gut-level instinct that something was watching me. I sat by the fire, my back against a fallen log, staring out into the dark, and I knew, without seeing, without hearing, that something was out there, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Close. I didn't move. I just listened. The usual forest sounds were gone. No crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hoots of an owl. Just silence, heavy, pressing. Then the softest sound, a footstep, not an animal, not the quick, darting movement of a deer or the light scurrying of a raccoon. This was slow, careful, human. I stayed still. My hand rested on my knife, the only real weapon I had. I didn't call out. I didn't move toward my tent. I just sat there, breathing slow, waiting. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then another step, closer this time. I stood up, fast, sudden, a warning. I didn't say anything, just held my ground, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see anything past the firelight, just trees and shadows. But I knew someone was there, and then nothing. The feeling didn't go away, but whoever or whatever was out there didn't move again. Not that I could hear. I waited, heart pounding, every nerve on edge, but nothing happened. No more footsteps, no sign of movement. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to sit back down. I kept the fire going as long as I could, feeding it stick after stick, watching the flames until exhaustion crept in. Eventually, I crawled into my tent, knife in hand, and lay there, listening. At some point, I slept. When I woke, it was morning. The fire had burned out, just cold embers and a few wisps of smoke curling into the air. The forest felt normal again. Birds calling, the sound of the creek flowing, sunlight filtering through the trees. But the feeling hadn't left me. I packed fast, barely stopping to eat. I didn't want to stay out here any longer than I had to. When I stepped out of the clearing, I looked back once, just for a second. And that's when I saw them. On the tree closest to my tent, fresh marks. Deep, deliberate cuts in the bark. New ones. I left fast. Didn't run, but I walked quicker than I ever had before, barely stopping to rest. 15 miles back to the trailhead, every step feeling like I was being followed. I never saw anyone, never heard another sound, but I know I wasn't alone that night, and I know without a doubt that someone else had been there, watching. I had always liked hiking alone. There was something about the silence of the woods, the feeling of being completely removed from the world, that drew me in. It was late September when I decided to do a 3-day hike through a stretch of national forest that I hadn't been to before. The trail was marked but not heavily used, and I liked that. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, and I could take in the land without the sounds of other hikers breaking the stillness. I parked my truck at the small gravel lot near the trailhead and slung my pack over my shoulders. The air had that crispness that comes with early autumn, cool in the shade but still warm in the sunlight. I checked my gear one last time: tent, sleeping bag, enough food, a full water bladder, extra socks, a knife, a lighter, my map, compass, and a GPS unit just in case. I wasn't new to this. The first few miles were steady, the kind of hiking that lets your mind wander. The trees were tall and dense, and I barely saw any sign of animals apart from the occasional squirrel or bird rustling in the undergrowth. The trail was covered in fallen leaves, making a soft crunch with each step. Felt good to be out here. No traffic, no phones ringing, just the sounds of nature. By late afternoon, I had covered a good distance and decided to set up camp. I found a spot just off the trail, near a small clearing where I could see the sky through the canopy. I pitched my tent, started a small fire, and ate a simple meal of dried meat and granola. As the sun sank lower, the temperature dropped quickly. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to the distant hoot of an owl before finally crawling into my tent. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. The forest was dark, the fire just glowing embers outside. I listened for a moment, but all I could hear was the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze, probably just a deer moving through the trees. I turned over and went back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and continued on. The trail became narrower, more overgrown. It was obvious that this part of the forest didn't see much foot traffic. I kept an eye on my map, making sure I stayed on course. The land rolled gently, nothing too steep, but enough to make my legs work. After about 6 hours of hiking, I stopped near a small creek to refill my water and eat. I knelt by the water's edge, filtering it into my bottle, when I noticed something strange. There were footprints in the mud near the creek, but they weren't fresh. The edges had started to break apart, dried by the sun. They were boot prints, but older than a few days. That wasn't the strange part, though. What struck me as odd was that they didn't follow a trail. They just stopped, like whoever made them had walked up to the water and never left. I stood up, scanning the trees around me. Nothing. Just the same quiet forest I had been walking through all day. I shook it off and kept moving. A few hours later, I was looking for another place to set up camp. I found a flat spot near a cluster of boulders, a good windbreak. As I set up my tent, I kept feeling like something was off. It was that prickling sensation on the back of your neck, the one you get when someone's watching you. But I was alone. I built a small fire again, just enough for warmth and comfort. The feeling didn't go away. I forced myself to eat, to go through my usual routine, but my hands felt stiff, my movements slower. I was letting my imagination get to me. That had to be it. That night, I barely slept. Every little sound outside felt too loud. The wind through the trees, the shifting of branches. At one point, I swore I heard footsteps crunching through the leaves. Not the quick, darting steps of an animal, but slow, deliberate ones. I held my breath, listening. They stopped. I told myself it was nothing. A falling branch, maybe. But I didn't fall back asleep until the sky began to lighten. The third day, I was supposed to loop back towards the trailhead. I packed up early, eager to be on the move. I had about 12 miles ahead of me, most of it downhill. Should have been easy. Should have been. An hour into my hike, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A footprint. A fresh one. Someone had walked this trail either that morning or late the night before. It wasn't mine. I checked my map, my GPS. This was supposed to be an isolated stretch of trail. No intersecting paths, no campsites nearby. But someone had been here. I picked up my pace. I wasn't running, but I wasn't taking my time anymore. Every few minutes, I glanced behind me, expecting to see someone there. Nothing, just trees. Still, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a shadow. Then, around midday, I found something worse. Tarp. A blue tarp, half buried under a pile of leaves just off the trail. It looked like it had been there a while, edges dirty, a corner torn. My gut told me to leave it alone, but I couldn't. I stepped closer, nudging the leaves with my boot. Underneath was a sleeping bag, and inside the sleeping bag, I didn't check. I saw enough. The shape beneath the fabric was unmistakable. I turned and walked, fast. My heart hammered in my chest. Someone had left that there, recently, and if I had found it, then maybe they were still around. The last miles of my hike were a blur. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't even look at my map. I just kept going until I saw the gravel lot where my truck was parked. I threw my pack in the bed and locked my doors as soon as I climbed inside. My hands were shaking as I turned the key. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of there, gravel spitting under my tires. I drove straight to the nearest ranger station. I told them everything. The footprints, the feeling of being watched, the tarp. They took me seriously. They sent a team out to investigate. A few days later, I got a call. They had found what I saw, and more. The remains were human. The cause of death was unclear, but they were investigating it as a possible homicide. They asked me if I had seen anyone on the trail. I hadn't. Not a single person. I still hike, but I never go alone anymore. I set out early that morning, the cool air of late autumn crisp against my skin. The forecast called for clear skies, perfect for a long hike deep into the mountains. I had planned this solo trip for weeks, carefully mapping out my route through a lesser-known section of national forest. The area was remote, sparsely traveled, and full of rugged beauty. It was exactly the kind of place I loved. I parked my truck on the side of an old logging road, far from any established trailheads. My plan was to hike out about 15 miles, set up camp near a small lake I had seen on the map, and return the following afternoon. I packed light but smart, enough food for 2 days, a reliable tent, my sleeping bag, and a small emergency kit. I carried my usual gear: a compass, map, flashlight, and a well-worn hunting knife strapped to my belt. I also had my .357 revolver holstered at my hip, just in case. I never went deep into the woods without it. The first few hours were peaceful, just the crunch of leaves beneath my boots and the occasional chatter of birds overhead. The terrain was tough but manageable, steep inclines followed by long stretches of dense forest. I took my time, following an old game trail that snaked through the trees, occasionally stopping to check my map. The lake wasn't far now, maybe another hour's hike at my current pace. As the sun climbed higher, I noticed something odd. The forest felt different, quieter. It wasn't the usual peaceful stillness I enjoyed on solo hikes. It was something else, something unnatural. I couldn't place it at first, but the more I walked, the more uneasy I felt. The normal sounds of the woods, birdsong, rustling leaves, distant calls of animals had faded. Even the wind seemed to have died down. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I shook off the feeling and pressed on. It wasn't the first time I had felt uneasy in the woods. Sometimes your mind played tricks on you when you were alone for too long. I told myself that was all it was. Then I saw the tracks. At first, I thought they belonged to a bear. Large, deep impressions in the dirt, spaced in a way that suggested something heavy had moved through recently. But as I looked closer, I realized they weren't quite right. The shape was wrong. Too elongated, with deep claw marks at the tips. They reminded me of something canine, but far bigger than any wolf I had ever seen. I crouched down, running my fingers through the fresh prints. They led off the trail, disappearing into the underbrush. I didn't follow them. Whatever made them was big. Bigger than any predator that should have been in these woods. A part of me wanted to turn back right then and there, but I was too far in. The lake was close, and I had come too far to let a few strange tracks send me packing. So I pushed forward, picking up my pace just a little. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was starting its descent. The water was still and dark, reflecting the orange hues of the sky. I found a decent spot to set up camp, a small clearing near the shoreline, surrounded by thick pines. As I unpacked my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. I told myself I was being paranoid. Night came quickly in the mountains. I built a small fire, ate a simple meal, and sat listening to the crackling wood. The unease from earlier still lingered, but the fire's warmth helped. I stared into the flames, trying to convince myself I was alone out here. Then I heard it, a rustling in the trees. Slow, deliberate, not the random movements of an animal wandering through the brush. Something was moving with purpose, circling my campsite. My hand went to my revolver. I sat still, listening. The sound would come, then stop. Come again, then stop. As if whatever it was wanted me to know it was there. I stood up, scanning the darkness beyond the fire's glow. Nothing, just trees and shadows. But I knew something was out there. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it toward the tree line. For a moment, I saw nothing. Then, just at the edge of the beam, something moved. A shape, tall, hunched, watching me from the darkness. I didn't wait to get a better look. I pulled my gun, fired a warning shot into the air, and shouted, hoping to scare off whatever was out there. The shot echoed through the trees, but the figure didn't move. Then, without a sound, it slipped back into the woods. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, gun in hand, staring into the darkness. Every so often, I heard it again, those slow, deliberate movements. Closer this time, watching, waiting. As soon as the first light of dawn broke, I packed up and got the hell out of there. I moved fast, ignoring the burning in my legs, the weight of my pack. I just wanted out. I didn't stop until I reached my truck. I threw my gear in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. For just a second, I thought I saw something step out of the trees. Something tall, something watching me. I didn't look back again. I never went back to that part of the forest, and I never hiked alone again. I set out early, just as the sun was beginning to rise over the ridge. The trailhead was about an hour from town, tucked away down a series of dirt roads that most people wouldn't bother with. That's what I liked about it. No crowds, no noise, just me and the forest. It was late October, the air cool but not freezing, the scent of damp earth and fallen leaves thick around me. I had planned for a 2-day hike, bringing enough supplies to camp overnight before looping back the next day. My pack was heavy but manageable, filled with the usual food, water, extra layers, and my small tent. The first few miles were easy. The ground was firm, the path well worn, and aside from the occasional squirrel or bird flitting through the branches, it was quiet. I passed an old trail marker, its paint peeling and faded, nailed to a tree that had started growing around it. A sign that not many people came through here often. That suited me just fine. I liked the solitude. A few hours in, I noticed the trail getting rougher. The leaves on the ground had turned thick and wet, making each step a little less certain. Roots jutted up at odd angles, and the further I went, the less defined the trail became. I wasn't worried, though. I had a map, a compass, and a GPS unit. I knew where I was. The trouble started when I reached the first clearing. It was a small, open space nestled between a few rocky outcrops, with an old fire ring in the center. Signs that someone had camped here before, but not recently. The rocks around the clearing were covered in moss, and the trees here were denser, their branches tangled like grasping fingers. It was the kind of place you'd expect to feel peaceful, but instead, something about it made me uneasy. I chalked it up to being alone. Solitude can play tricks on the mind. I pressed on, the trail narrowing, winding between the boulders and dipping into a shallow ravine. The further I went, the more overgrown it became. By mid-afternoon, I was stepping over fallen logs and pushing through tangled branches. I hadn't seen a single trail marker in miles, and though my GPS still showed I was on track, the landscape didn't match the map as well as it should have. Then I noticed the first sign that something wasn't right. There were boot prints in the mud, fresh ones. At first, I was relieved. It meant someone else had been through here recently, maybe even earlier that morning. But the more I looked, the stranger they seemed. They weren't following the trail. Instead, they meandered, crossing back and forth erratically, like someone was pacing or wandering aimlessly. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone scouting for a good camping spot. But my gut told me otherwise. As the day stretched on, the woods around me started to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks darker, the undergrowth thicker. The sunlight barely made it through the canopy, casting everything in a dull, lifeless gray. The silence was deeper now, heavier. And then I saw it, a tattered piece of fabric, caught on a low-hanging branch. It was dirty, weathered, but unmistakably man-made. My stomach tightened. Someone had come this way, and judging by the state of the cloth, it had been a while since they left. I should have turned back then, but I didn't. I kept going, climbing up a steep incline where the trail should have been. At the top, the land flattened out again, and that's when I found the first real sign that something was very wrong. A campsite, or what was left of one. The tent was collapsed, its poles snapped. A sleeping bag lay half unzipped, filled with leaves. Nearby, a rusted cooking pot was overturned, its contents long gone. The whole site looked abandoned, but not in a way that suggested someone had packed up and left. It looked like whoever had been here had left in a hurry. And then I saw the footprints again. They circled the site, overlapping in a confusing mess, as if whoever had been here had been walking around in frantic circles. My skin crawled. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it had been bad weather or an animal. But as I stepped closer, I saw something that made my breath catch. A backpack half buried under leaves. I pulled it free, my fingers trembling. It was heavy with dampness, the fabric stiff. I unzipped it slowly, my heart pounding in my ears. Inside, I found clothes, a few granola bars, a flashlight, and a notebook. I opened it. The pages were warped, the ink smeared, but I could still make out the handwriting. The entries were short, frantic. Something is following me. I hear footsteps at night. I tried to leave, but I keep ending up back here. The last entry was only 3 words long. Don't look back. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the trees around me. My skin prickled, every instinct screaming at me to go. I turned back the way I came, moving fast, almost running. I didn't stop to check my GPS, didn't pause to rest. The woods felt different now, pressing in on me, watching. It was nearly dark by the time I finally found my way back to the first clearing. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't stop. I didn't stop until I saw my car, parked exactly where I left it. I threw my pack in the back, started the engine, and drove without looking in the rearview mirror. I don't know what happened to whoever left that notebook. I don't want to know. All I know is that I won't be going back. Not ever. I was hiking deep in the mountains, far from any roads or cell service. The trail I was following wasn't marked on any official maps. It was an old logging road I had found while scouring satellite images before the trip. The goal was to spend a few days exploring, camping in solitude, and testing my endurance. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, but this one was further off-grid than I'd ever gone. I had planned for 5 days. My pack was loaded with all the essentials: food, water purification gear, a lightweight tent, a sleeping bag, and a first aid kit. My rifle was slung over my shoulder, mostly for peace of mind. I wasn't afraid of animals as much as I was of running into the wrong kind of people. The first day was uneventful. I followed the overgrown road up into the hills, winding through thick pines and occasional clearings where stumps and log piles hinted at long-abandoned industry. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine sap. I made camp in a small clearing near a stream, cooked a quick meal, and turned in early. The only sounds were the wind in the trees and the distant call of an owl. On the second day, I pushed deeper into the wilderness. The road had faded into little more than a faint indentation in the underbrush, and I had to rely on my GPS to keep track of my location. At midday, I found something odd: a set of footprints crossing the path. They weren't mine and they weren't fresh, but they were human. There were no nearby trails or access points for miles. I crouched down to study them. They were deep, well-defined, and heading in the same direction I was. Whoever had left them had been carrying a heavy load. My first thought was a hunter, but there were no shell casings or any other signs of hunting activity. I kept moving. As the sun began to set, I started looking for a place to camp. I found a spot near a rocky outcrop, a good defensible position with a clear view of the surroundings. I built a small fire, cooked my meal, and sat in silence, listening to the forest settle into darkness. The air had an unusual stillness to it, the way it does before a storm. But there were no clouds, no wind, just an odd quiet. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The fire had died down to embers, casting a faint glow around the campsite. I listened, then I heard it, something moving in the underbrush, a slow, deliberate crunch of twigs, then stillness. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. Another sound, closer this time. Whatever it was moving with purpose. My hand found the rifle beside me, fingers tightening around the grip. I waited, straining my ears. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the movement stopped. I stayed awake for hours listening, but heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion won out and I drifted off. Morning came and I checked the area. No tracks, no signs of anything unusual. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up quickly and moved on. By the third day, I had reached the deepest part of my route. The forest here was thick, untouched. I found an old game trail and followed it down toward a valley. The air felt heavy, humid despite the cool temperature. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten, another set of footprints. fresh this time, and not just one set, two, maybe three. They were heading in the same direction I was going. I stopped and scanned the woods around me. Nothing moved. The forest was silent again, that same unnatural stillness. I didn't like it. I considered turning back, but it would take me another 2 days just to reach where I started. I decided to press forward, but at a slower pace, more alert than before. By late afternoon, I stumbled upon something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A camp. It was old, abandoned, tents left to rot, gear scattered, tarps sagging under the weight of dead leaves. It looked like it had been there for years, yet there were signs of recent disturbance. A fire pit had fresh ashes. A backpack lay half buried in the dirt, unzipped, its contents missing. And then I saw the knife. It was stuck into a tree at head height, the blade buried deep in the bark. A message, a warning. I didn't linger. I backed away, keeping my rifle at the ready. As I turned to leave, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A figure, just for a second, standing in the trees beyond the camp. Then it was gone. I moved fast, pushing myself harder than I ever had. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't stop to eat. I just kept moving, retracing my steps, forcing my body forward despite exhaustion clawing at my muscles. That night, I didn't make a fire. I barely slept. Every sound made me tense. I gripped my rifle in the darkness and waited. By dawn, I was already moving. The forest felt like it was closing in, the trees too thick, the silence pressing in around me. I had never felt so alone, yet so certain that I wasn't. Then I saw them, at the edge of a clearing maybe 50 yards away. 3 figures standing still, facing me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran. I didn't stop until I was back on a real trail, until the trees started to thin, until I could hear the distant hum of civilization. When I finally reached my truck, I locked the doors and drove until I was hours away. I never reported it. I never told anyone, but I never went back either. I had always been drawn to the wilderness. There was something about being out in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by trees and silence, that made me feel more at home than anywhere else. I'd done plenty of solo hikes before, some lasting days at a time. I knew how to prepare, how to read the terrain, how to stay safe. Or at least I thought I did. It was late September when I decided to take a solo hiking trip through a stretch of remote forest I hadn't explored before. The area was about 30 miles from the nearest town, and from what I had read, it was rarely visited outside of hunting season. I planned a 3-day trip, packed my gear, and set out early in the morning to make good time before nightfall. The first day was uneventful. The trail was rugged but manageable, and the forest was thick with towering pines and dense underbrush. The further I went, the more isolated it felt. There were no signs of other hikers, no footprints, no trash, nothing. It was exactly what I had hoped for. I set up camp near a small creek and ate a quick meal before turning in for the night. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Sometime in the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. I listened, but all I could hear was the gentle flow of the creek and the wind moving through the trees. I lay still, waiting for my senses to pick up on whatever had stirred me. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound. It was distant, but steady. Not the kind of noise the wind makes, and not an animal scurrying through the underbrush. It sounded deliberate. I sat up, straining my ears. The tapping continued for another few minutes, then stopped. I waited, but it didn't start again. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just a tree branch knocking against another tree and forced myself back to sleep. The next morning, I packed up and continued deeper into the forest. The terrain grew steeper, and the trail became less distinct. By midday, I had to rely on my map and compass to keep my bearings. I had planned to reach a clearing near the base of a ridge before nightfall, where I'd set up camp for the second night. About an hour before sunset, I came across something that made me stop in my tracks. It was a pile of rocks, stacked neatly in the middle of the trail. Not natural, not something that had just happened by chance. Someone had put them there, The sight of it put me on edge. I wasn't near any official trails, and as far as I knew, no one else was supposed to be out here. I walked around the pile carefully and kept moving, telling myself it was probably just an old marker left by a hunter or another hiker. That night, I camped in the clearing as planned. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and ate my meal. The woods were quiet, eerily so. The usual sounds of birds and small animals were absent. As the fire burned low, I thought about the stacked rocks again. There was something about them that unsettled me. They weren't just randomly placed. They were positioned with purpose. I shook off the feeling and turned in for the night, making sure to secure my gear and keep my knife within reach. Sometime in the early morning hours, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't just a feeling. There was noise. It was close. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. I stayed completely still, listening. The steps moved around my tent, circling. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot. I reached for my knife, gripping it tightly. The footsteps stopped. Then, after a long pause, they moved away, fading into the trees. I lay awake for hours, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for them to return. They didn't. At first light, I packed up quickly and started hiking back the way I came. I wanted to be out of those woods as soon as possible. I kept my pace fast, my senses on high alert. Every little sound put me on edge. Around midday, I came across something that stopped me cold. There, in the middle of the trail, was another stack of rocks, identical to the one I had seen the day before. It hadn't been there when I passed this way earlier. Someone had placed it there after I had walked through. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was following me, watching me. I picked up my pace, practically speed walking through the forest. I wanted out. As the afternoon wore on, I felt a growing sense of unease. The feeling of being watched was constant. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I checked over my shoulder repeatedly, but I never saw anything, just trees. Miles and miles of dense, silent trees. Then, about 2 miles from where my car was parked, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing just off the trail, partially hidden by the trees. Too far to make out any details, but close enough that I knew they were watching me. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then the figure took a step back into the trees and disappeared. I didn't think. I just ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, my pack bouncing against my back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I just ran until I burst out of the trees and into the small dirt lot where my car was parked. My hands shook as I fumbled for my keys. I threw my gear into the back, started the engine, and tore out of there, gravel spraying behind me. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, back among people, back where I felt safe. I never reported it. What would I say? That I saw a couple of stacks of rocks? That I heard footsteps in the night? That I saw someone in the woods? There was no crime, no evidence. Just a feeling. A horrible, gut-wrenching feeling that I was not supposed to be there. I haven't gone back to that part of the forest since. And I never will.